Good morning, everybody, and welcome this morning. We are really happy to be having a coffee chat with Celina Caesar-Chavannes. First, before we start, I want to acknowledge that Dalhousie University is situated on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We are all treaty people. So my name is Lori Turnbull, and I'm the director of the School of Public Administration at Dalhousie. I'm just going to introduce you to this morning's panel, and then I will leave it to them to have a great conversation with you. So we're very excited today to be joined by Tari Ajadi and Celina Caesar-Chavannes. Let me tell you a little bit about each one of them. So Celina is a business consultant, a coach, and an international speaker. She currently serves as a senior advisor for EDI initiatives and an adjunct lecturer at Queen's University. Her book is called Can You Hear Me Now? And is published by Penguin Random House. She was the former member of Parliament for Whitby, parliamentary secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Parliamentary Secretary for International Development. So this morning, Celina is going to be having a conversation led by Tari Ajadi. Tari is a PhD candidate here at the Department of Political Science at Dalhousie, and he's a very close friend of mine. I also want to acknowledge very much the support of the Department of Political Science, the Dalhousie University, or the Dalhousie Undergraduate Political Science Society, and the School of Public Administration. We really appreciate that support coming through this morning so we'd be able to have this event. So welcome Tari and Celina, and Tari, I'll let you take over. I'll let you lead the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. And thank you, Celina, for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be able to have this coffee chat with you.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it. It's bright and early here in Ontario, but looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Thanks for getting up so early. You mentioned earlier that the first line in your book is that you're not a morning person. So I really appreciate you.
Nobody read the book. Why are you asking me to get up early?
Absolutely. So, for me, I've been reading your book, Can You Hear Me Now? And it's a really multifaceted and nuanced text that demonstrates, broadly defined, your struggles against and triumphs within a host of institutions that weren't designed for people like you or people like me in mind, right? Mm. And so for our viewers who haven't yet gotten a chance to pick up a copy, I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about your motivation for writing the book and just give us a bit of a high-level overview for some of the takeaways from your perspective.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Tari, and thank you to Lori Turnbull for having me. Thank you for Dalhousie University for this opportunity to be here this morning to have a chat. Before we begin, I am not at Dalhousie. I'm in Ontario at my home in Whitby, so I do want to acknowledge that I am speaking from my home in Whitby, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, Williams Treaty Territory. And Tari, we just got out of Black History Month, so I'm going to finish my land acknowledgement and then go into answering your question. We just came out of Black History Month, and it is a time when, it really resonates with you how important the land acknowledgements are and the shared sort of ancestry that we have with the Indigenous people of Canada are, being removed from our land, our identity being taken away, the atrocities that have happened. We have like this intersecting history. So when I give when I acknowledge the land, there's a certain degree of burden that goes with that, but it's done in a way to honor the history of the first peoples of this land, and it goes into why I wrote the book, because one of the reasons is because often when we look at our own history books, there is an erasure from them of stories of Black individuals, Indigenous people. And so I wanted to make sure that there was an accurate account of what happened while I was here, or I was there, or wherever I was, right?
Right.
The Ontario Black History Society did a campaign a few weeks ago where they blacked out the pages of a textbook that our children would read, anywhere between grade school and high school, and they blacked out. So in a textbook that had about 200 plus pages, there were only about a dozen pages that had any reference to Black history.
Absolutely.
That's critically important. So in writing the book, I wanted there to be a history, but I wanted there to be not just an account of what happened while I was there, but an account for people to understand that, usually they see the bling, they see Celina and her fancy scarf at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
And they're like, oh, she's made it. But they don't see the blood, sweat, and tears that gets into making it, so to speak. And I think it's very important in our worlds to sort of put those fibers back together and to allow our vulnerabilities to connect us a little bit more. And so I wrote the book in that kind of way, as a connection, as one that's steeped in empathy and humanity.
And I love that so much, because I think that emerges from the book so clearly, right? And when we're thinking about these kinds of struggles and that sense of linked fate and shared history, I'm really kind of compelled to kind of dig into some of the, I suppose, kind of like lessons that you've outlined in the book, things that if you haven't been there before, if you haven't kind of been engaged in entrepreneurship, if you haven't been engaged with our political system, you might not necessarily understand it till it happens to you. Yeah. And so, with that in mind, one of the things that really resonated with me is in your introduction. I called it the thesis statement when I was sitting down now it's reading. You said, we need politics to be different, but the powers that be keep fiddling around the edges, not attacking the structure itself, which was designed to reinforce the status quo. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that seems like the sentiment that ground your experiences growing up in school, in university, in the workplace as an entrepreneur, and of course in politics. And I'll stop rambling in a second, but I have this very broad question to ask you. I mean,
you can ramble, that's okay.
Oh, it's no problem. But you have these examples of some of the ways that you fought really kind of intensely for these vital initiatives, but also these kind of recognition of things that have been undercut. So whether it's the recognition of the decade for people of African descent, or minimal funding for issues like mental health, particularly in Black communities. And these initiatives were undercut despite the presence of Black cabinet ministers, Black MPs like yourself. And you also give examples of how people of influence within your former party, including Black folks, were either silent or even actively harmful to you in maintaining the status quo, which really, I like that you complicated the narrative of this kind of very static identity markers, right? And so with that in mind, my question is, who do we trust with the responsibility for pushing for social and economic justice, especially when our political and economic systems diminish and neuter your demands for transformation? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yes, I do. But you want me to save the world? It's not even like 9 o'clock yet, bro.
Fair enough.
Wow, I've never been asked that question before. So let me just unpack this question a little bit, because maybe I'll figure out the answer as I'm doing it. So we have to remember that like places like Parliament were built on exclusionary principles: no women, no Indigenous people, no Black people. And then of course that status quo was not only maintained, but reinforced, sort of baked into the walls, into the brick, by policy that was oppressive and racist policy. So Indian Act, residential schools, anti-Black immigration policy that was reinforced and baked into the walls of the institution. And then we show up 100 or so years later.
150 years.
Yeah. Because like the first Black female member of Parliament, Jean Augustine, is still alive. Like I texted her a couple of days ago, right? Like it's like, hey, Mama Jean, how's it going? So it's not like we have this history of being there that is so long and storied. It's quite short. So then we show up, and then we're saying, okay, in the 42nd Parliament in particular, it was bold, transformative government done differently. And then it was hashtag diversity is our strength, hashtag add women, change politics, plus the fact that we had a majority. So, the push for me was like, okay, I don't really have to push because we're bold. We're doing things differently. And we got a majority. Like, we're repealing mandatory minimums. We're going to have the international, like things are going to happen. Right. And so I get in there and I'm like, whoa, I'm pushing, but like,
there's a resistance. What's happening here? Right.
Why am I having? I don't even think it's moving. Like, what is going on? Like, you're looking around, and finally things start to move, but they're not moving in a way that is actually defined, as I interpret it, as bold or transformative. And so who do you trust? I don't quite know. So I think so when people say, we need more women to run, I say we don't just need more women to run. We need more people who are not afraid to bend the status quo. We need people who are not afraid to break glass ceilings, but not because they want just the fame of breaking the glass ceilings, but because they know that when if they're closest to the glass, it's going to fall and they're going to get cut. So we need people who aren't afraid to get cut by the falling glass. It's not the glass ceiling breakers. It's the people who are not afraid to get hurt in the cut from the falling glass, right? It's two different.
Right.
And so who do we need? Who do we trust? We trust those who have identified as really understanding the urgency of now, especially coming out of 2020, that we can no longer be performative, that people are actually dying.
Yes.
This is not like, we have young brothers, indigenous brothers and sisters that are just sitting in our penitentiaries at disproportionate rates because of bias and racism that exists in a system that was built on exclusionary principles.
Right.
The urgency of now demands that we have people that are not afraid to get cut.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a really powerful statement. The idea that, we've got to have people that are willing to stand in the face of the pain that these broader systems might inflict in order to kind of create a new space, to disrupt this particular kind of harm. And kind of remove that. And of course, you mentioned 2020, last year. I'm sure you were out in the streets. I was out in the streets, right? Like we're marching, we're doing all of these different kinds of things. And as things have kind of settled down, so to speak, we're getting into this kind of nitty-gritty area of, okay, we've created this disruptive space. What's going to happen next? And it's thrown up all kinds of very interesting contradictions in type. And so what I'm wondering is, for you now transitioning out of a space of being a legislator and moving into the university space, you're engaging in kind of EDI initiatives. What does that framing do for you? Does it open up more kinds of avenues for change in terms of EDI now than being a legislator, where you have to conform very strictly to the party line, and if you don't, well, if you pick up a copy of the book, you'll learn exactly what happens when you don't stick to the party line. So do you think that the university space opens up more avenues for possible change, transformative change, or do you think it's a kind of similarly constricting kind of avenue, and you have to be strategic in that space as well?
So just to rewind, I was out in the streets in 2020, but I was also out there in 1992.
Exactly. That's what, right. And that's the really interesting
I don't want to be the woke grandma that's out there in 2050. I'm just not, I don't want to be that person. So no matter what space that you are in, these traditional spaces were built on exclusionary principles. So Queen's University, being there when I first was invited to go there, I actually turned down the offer. And because it was around recruiting students into a space that I knew had a toxic culture, right?
Right.
So no matter what space that you're in, there's some parts of you that are going to have to conform if you choose to do so. So a traditional university space is no different from a political space, right? They're both very traditional. But when I decided to go to Queens, and speaking to Dean Philpott, what I said to her was, I will come to Queens if I'm part of the movement that transforms the culture of the space. So it was not just enough to put hashtag Black Lives Matter on the screen or black out your social media and then say, okay, now that we've done those two things, what we're going to do now is we're going to diversify our university, because the goal is not diversity. If you wanted diversity, you could have had it, right? You wanted to get more Black students, more Black teachers, more Indigenous, more people with disabilities. You could have done that, right? And it's quite easy to do because our population is diverse, right?
Right.
That is easy. That is a very low bar to set for yourself as an institution. What you need to do is set a higher bar, set better goals, like the kids say, like hashtag goals, right?
Right.
And the goal is equity. And how do you do that? Well, you need to transform the culture of the institution, which is the same thing that needs to happen in Parliament, which is the same thing that has to happen in, our banking institutions or our school organizations, anywhere. And because, as Peter Drucker famously said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if your strategy is around diversity and your culture is toxic, your culture is actually going to, when you sprinkle diversity into that toxic culture, into that soil, it will choke it.
Right.
It will kill it. So all of that diversity you sprinkle in will leave. Hence, Celina sprinkled into a culture that was toxic, you leave, right? Because I don't plan on dying in there. So what you need to do is actually transform the culture of your organization so that once you sprinkle the diversity, which you have lots of seeds of, sprinkle that in, the inclusion will grow. You'll have those connections. People will be talking to each other because they're not competing. They're actually collaborating. They're actually finding ways to share their stories and create the empathy that is required to then get us to a point where we're talking about equity, which is the actual goal, but it requires action. So, that for me is the next. I'm not conforming, but I'm actually pushing organizations that have the leadership capacity. So we don't only have Dean Philpott, but we also have Patrick Jean as the principal of the University of Queen's University, who have the mindset that, we want to transform the culture. So it has to come from the top, but it also has to come from the bottom. If the tone is not set from the top, there's nothing that's going to happen to the culture for that organization that is going to be transformative enough to make that diversity translate into equity.
Right. And I think that this idea of transformative leadership resonates throughout your book, right? Like this idea that it's not simply enough for people within the context of an organization to kind of sit around and wait for something to happen, that there has to be a kind of grounding force, a kind of engine that drives this forward and says, no, this is what we're going to do next. This is what we're going to do next. And what I wonder is, as someone who's very, my research and my kind of focus in the context of my life broadly defined as social movements, right? It's kind of activism. It's kind of this networked sense of leadership, but in a different way. I'm wondering how we can foster transformative leadership that doesn't exist in these kinds of hierarchical ways. What I observed when reading through your memoir, particularly in, of course, your dealings with the Prime Minister and with the party broadly defined, was that it wasn't simply the fact that they didn't care about the things you cared about, but it was also the fact that they used their hierarchy to exclude you. Right, and they use the capacity, the levers of the office to dismiss you. And so, what I'm wondering is how we can re-envision leadership within these very hierarchical confines, whether it's the federal public service, politics, and still in universities, despite what flighty academics like to think, there are still hierarchies there, right?
Yeah. So whenever I hear about that, it actually it puts a lump in my throat, because I've never understood why I was so excluded, especially in 2017, but that's beside the point. How do we foster transformative leadership? Well, first of all, we need to understand what it means, right? So Dr. Carolyn Shields gives a very good definition of transformative leadership, not transformational, transformative. And the transformative part, so you use your values and your principles as the foundation by which you are able to take a moral stand. So to stand on the right side of history, to live with tension, meaning that you're not afraid to have the awkward conversation with the unusual suspect, and that you're able to engage in advocacy and activism, right? So when you talk about transformative leaders and where they're unwavering around those things of taking a stand, tension, and advocacy, Clayton Christensen, in his essay, How Will You Measure Your Life? He's a Harvard professor that died a few months ago. He said that it's easier to stand by your principles 100% of the time than it is to stand by them 98%.
Right.
It's that moment that transformative leaders say, well, maybe this just one time, the marginal cost of error. Maybe just this one time we could just forget about, the Black community, or maybe just one time we could instead of giving them, the 200 million that will actually fix the problem, we'll give them 9 because they really don't know the difference, right?
Right.
Maybe we'll just do that, which is actually what happened, right?
Right. Absolutely.
For mental health, well, let's just give them 9 over 5 years, and it's really
it'll figure itself out, right? Like this is start of money, yeah.
Right? And so this is where, we actually have to understand how to start to breed a generation of transformative leaders who understand, who have the empathy that is necessary to transform these spaces. You cannot just say, oh, I'm going to transform the spaces, and you have no idea what people's experiences are, and no idea of how they hurt, no idea of the current context of the problem and where the root of the problem came from, no idea how to put that strategy forward, and no idea that you have to put the sacrifice, you have to put some skin in the game.
Right.
If you don't have skin in the game, what do you care?
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Well, they don't have mental health services, so mandatory minimums, we repeal part of them, but not all of them. I mean, it's really not that big a deal. I mean, I'm not in jail, so
right.
You know what I mean? So this is what we need individuals who actually understand that they need, based on their unwavering principles and values, that they will advocate for those who need it the most. And Tari, let's be clear, we are experiencing a global pandemic, racial inequality, climate change, a growing refugee crisis. We have things that are happening around the world. These shocks to our political, social, and economic systems are not going anywhere anytime soon. And if we are not going to have people that actually understand how to advocate and how to do this right, we are going to continue to leave people behind in a G7 country.
Right.
Never mind the rest of the world.
This is it. I mean, you opened up the kind of thread of Bill C-22, so I want to pull on that for a second, because that's a core piece of legislation that I've been thinking a lot about.
You want to get me fired up this morning? I feel sorry for my next meeting, because I'll be like,
no, because that's what I'm all about, right? Like this is precisely it. Like, there's this idea that if we can just kind of walk this middle line, if we can say we'll do just enough of this to keep people quiet without really standing in what it would mean to decriminalize drugs, without really standing in what it would mean to repeal all mandatory minimums, then we can kind of maximize our efficiency with this particular piece of legislation. And what I'm curious about is what that process of negotiation was like from the inside, right? Like when you were sitting and discussing legislation, did things start with these big, broad principles, or did they start from the kind of perspective of, well, here's what we need to do in order to satisfy X or Y segment of the electorate? Like where did the conversation start within the party?
So the conversation already started because everybody knew what needed to happen. Everybody knew that, mandatory minimums, prison reform needs to happen because it disproportionately impacts Black and Indigenous people, and not because they're worse or more or badder. I don't even know what word to use. You're the PhD, the badder than everybody else. Like when you read that Globe and Mail article around bias behind bars or biases in prisons, you can see that even when they account for all other variables compared to their white counterparts, that Black and Indigenous people are in there because of bias. They call bias, but racism within the system. So it's not because they're worse. It's because there's actually problems within the system that account for it. So, so we know, let's just start from the fact that we already know this. So stop with the consulting, stop with the, well, you need to understand. There's nothing you need to understand except for the fact that you're being ignorant about what you understand. Okay.
Right.
Let's start from there. So we already know this. And then we're like, okay, so we need to repeal mandatory minimums. I think where the conversation goes is, okay, let's pull this and see, see how politically expedient it is for me to do this. Will this go well? Will we get reelected? Will we look soft on crime to the opposition? It has now not been about what is for the greater good. It is now about, well, we did promise it in 2015, but we
Right.
just told, but I'm not sure if we really want to do that, because then it's going to like screw up my opportunities. I don't want
Absolutely.
to be reelected, so I'm not doing that. And that is where, for me, it was like, what are you talking about? Or even when we talked about, expungements of records for cannabis.
Oh, yeah.
The conversation with myself and Bill Blair was like, so are you going to support expungements of cannabis? Well, Celina, I don't know if we should do that. I'm like, well, why not? Like, you do remember Tavis, right?
Right.
Like,
well, yeah, he should remember very well, right? Like, absolutely.
I'm just like this was your jam, like, and you were like pulling brothers, like, it's like, well, yeah, we know that they were doing weed in other communities too, but we're over surveilling that, which is a violation of the human rights. But yeah, we were doing that, and we have a lot of them in jail now. But Celina, they have more than one record. Well, they have more than one record because if they sneeze too hard, you were right there to arrest them. So
that's precisely it.
How would you not want to at least redress on the way to equity, redress at least this,
show the harms that have been done,
harms that have been done, remove this record, even if they have 3 strikes or whatever you want to call it, remove this one, and just at least show them some mercy, some grace, some redemption. And that wasn't happening at all.
Right. So, and this is it, right? We have these broad kind of banner statements that work within the context of elections. And you know, in 2015, the Liberal Party was elected on a mandate, I think, really unlike anything that we've seen for at least the past 20 or 30 years, a broad sweeping mandate to be able to implement a particular agenda. And that political capital, you might argue, never really went anywhere. And I think it's for precisely these reasons, right? It's for precisely this kind of narrow playing to a very specific frame. Sorry.
We had a majority. So it's not just the fact that we said we had like some very sticky taglines. We actually had a majority to do this. If we wanted it to be done, if the 42nd Parliament, if they wanted it to be done, Tari, let me tell you right now, and this is why it's so painful, it would have been done. This is why when people say, Celina, well, you're kind of angry, and I don't want to fall into that trope of the angry Black woman. I'm like, I don't care anymore, because I actually am angry. And I'm not angry because I plan on going to jail anytime soon, Tari. I don't plan on going to jail. I'm angry because I know this destroys people. These are people. And I'm going to go back. I'm going to say empathy a lot, because I think that is what's missing: our empathy, our humanity, the ability to give grace to other people. I'm angry because it seems like we talk about the dehumanization and the destruction of Black bodies, and it is done in such subtle ways that it's blatantly clear to me. That's why I call politics painfully beautiful, because I was able to actually see from the inside how much you can't do this to people.
Absolutely. I really want to continue on this vein, but I also have a couple of questions written down here from the Undergraduate Political Science Society, who've been so gracious in supporting this event, and who've been, really great advocates for a whole host of events at Dalhousie. And so I want to take this opportunity to read a couple of these questions.
Okay, I'll answer my question shorter. Yes, okay, go.
Yeah, no, I've been rambling too. So, it's not an issue, but I wanted to make sure that I got a couple of their questions in. So maybe we can do a couple of these in a rapid fire way.
Yes.
So firstly, what made you want to become a member of Parliament in the first place? That's one question that I would send.
Yeah, so from 2005 to 2015, I owned my own healthcare-based research management firm. At the time, like around 2013, I didn't know whether I wanted to continue with the company or stop and go into a private organization. And I was co-chairing Canada's first national epidemiology study on neurological conditions, looking at scope, impact, health services, and risk factors. And one of the things that we were doing was having the scientists at the table, but also people with lived experience, right? So we could match the data with the lived experience, see whether it worked. And people were saying that they would either have to move from a province to province to get their drugs covered, or they'd have to separate from their partner to get services covered. Like heartbreaking stuff.
Right.
I can't make this stuff up. Like, it's so heartbreaking. And so I thought, oh my God. And then for the first time ever, I was doing my MBA at the time, for the first time ever, I was in a political science class, and they're like talking about political capital and the capacity for politicians to help with business problems. And I'm like, problem here. I don't have the politics side, but I have a big problem. I want to help people, and I don't have the politics side. So I was like,
Okay, well,
yeah, that was it. Like, so that was December 2013. February 2014, I Googled how to become a member of a political party, and I just thought I'd be a member. Throw out some policy things about this, and whatever, something will stick. And then on March 8th, International Women's Day of 2014, which is like less than 3 months later, I get this email that says, invite her to run. Do you know a woman who would be interested in the next federal election, running in the next federal election? I was like, do I know her? I am her.
I am her, right. I mean, and that stood out to me as well. I highlighted that piece as well. I read on a Kindle, but I highlighted that specific piece as well, because it's, you get this email, and it's a really brave step, and it kind of contravenes a lot of the political science literature about, okay, well, how is it precisely that racialized women, Black women, end up running for federal politics? Typically, there's like deep personal connections, and the riding association president goes, "We really need you to run this time," and typically they run. They're running kind of ridings that will never really work out the first time. You run again and again, and you took a very different path. And so what I'm wondering is, do you think that more targeted outreach, kind of like that email or kind of connections with the riding association president, would encourage more women to run in federal or provincial office? Or what more do you think these parties need to do to encourage particularly Black women to be members?
I don't think so. I think, and without sounding completely arrogant, I think what I've done changes that more. Show them that you could be real in politics. Show them the push in politics. Show them that, that what you see in a suit and well-coiffed hair is not the only definition of what a politician is. Politicians can keep it real. They could wear their braids. They could be dope. They could, they could transcend traditional sort of narratives, and still advocate for their communities, all of their identifying communities. So not just the people of Whitby, which I did, on the small business tax changes and things like that. Like, I'm advocating there, but I could also advocate for Black communities. I could also advocate for people with multiple intersecting identities, because once you get to that table, you don't really have a choice but to advocate for all of us, right?
Right, so, absolutely.
Right. So that, I think that does a lot more than just that, as well as parties saying, I don't know about the party thing.
Right. So, because that's the thing, right? Like we read about, okay, well, if the riding association president does X, Y, and Z, well, potentially there's a greater likelihood, right? And I don't know, having worked in politics previously, I don't know whether that recruitment would necessarily work, and B, as you've identified, what happens when you get there, right? It's not simply enough to recruit. It's enough. It's about transforming something more rigorously, including the political parties. That's really.
I ran in a riding that I was not supposed to win. So on March 8th, Jim Flaherty was still alive.
Right.
So I wanted to run against Jim. Right. I wanted to go up against the beast. So at least create that political capital. I'm going to lose, but whatever. At least I tried it out, and I have no regret. But when he did pass, people were like, "You're the lamb to the slaughter. Why would you run? First of all, why would you want to run against him? But what
Right.
I'm learning is ghost. Like,
Right. Right.
lady. Nobody flew across the country. Nobody asked me 7 times. Nobody. It was just a decision that I made, and it was one in which I promised the people of Whitby that I was going to be authentic, that I was going to be their voice, that I was going to stand up for them. And those things, back to the beginning conversation around principles, I was not going to waver. I was unwavering in that.
Fantastic. Okay, so kind of on a similar thread, here's another question from one of the undergraduate students. They said, what advice would you give Black, Indigenous, people of color students at Dalhousie who encounter racism, tokenism, and performative allyship every day? How do you call out performative allyship when you're the only Black or Indigenous person of color in the room? And I have my own thoughts, but please.
Yeah. So what I would say is, don't do what I do, because I clap back, but I'm in a different space, right? So I'm 46 years old. When I was in politics, they couldn't fire me. You have to be safe within your own context. And so what the advice I would give is, young people really need to do this anyway, not just because they're the only ones in the room and they need to protect themselves, but you really need to start creating different circles of influence. So you have your family circle, you have your friend circle, but you need to start creating these different sort of getting outside of your comfort zone and building relationships with people. So when these sorts of things happen, you could leverage your village. When I talk about leveraging your villages, it means you could activate certain people who could help you in that situation so that you don't actually have to do it yourself. So right now I have different groups of women that I work with, I'll just say, or people that I work with, and nobody knows that we're connected. But when something goes down and they meet a roadblock or they have a barrier, then we figure out a strategy to help that person stay protected, because we don't want them to lose their job or, marks or whatever the case may be.
Right.
But then we activate the people around her and say, who could get her out of this situation, or who could talk to the person that is bullying her, or who could figure out how to make this company understand that what is happening to this person or what's happening is wrong. And we strategize around that. So the village is activated, and then depends on who does what. We all do what our role is supposed to be. That's very vague, but that is the only way that I can talk about
No,
it.
I don't think that's vague at all. No, I really think that's important, especially within the context of a university, right? Because what happens in your particular class or in your particular department might feel confining and defining. And you're saying, okay, well, especially for an undergraduate student, I'm an adult for the first time. I've left home for the first time. And here's all of these things that are happening to me. And I don't know how to be an agent in this process.
Yes.
And so the way that you can be an agent in the process, despite the fact you shouldn't have to be, is by engaging with folks whose job it is to stand for you, right? And so I think it's really important that you highlight the fact that there is a responsibility for those that are in a position of mentorship, that are in a position of leadership, that have the license to protect others. And there are a whole host of people that are doing some incredible things at Dalhousie, and I want to make sure that they're acknowledged in this conversation for doing precisely that.
Right.
They can stand for you in those moments. Yeah. Yes. So it's about getting to them.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Get to know them, build the rapport, get that conversation going, build that trust. And then when you need to activate, they're ready. You need to understand that you need to protect yourself. And some people, this is not for everybody. Some people will just clap back right away, and then it's good for you, right? I'm talking about from a broader perspective of the word. I want to make sure I protect Black students. I want to make sure that I protect students that need us the most. So when things are happening at other universities, you see me on Twitter. Like I don't know these students, but I engage with them because I want them to know that they have someone who's going to protect them. So and I usually go into their DMs and say, get off Twitter. I'll handle it now. Go study your books.
Yeah.
That's what you should be doing. So I'm going to send a few tweets. I'm going to do a video. I'm going to handle this for you, but you go study, get off the internet And then they say, yes, Auntie. And they go, and they don't know me.
They don't know you, but hey,
They don't know
no,
me,
for sure.
but they know that if they don't go study, I'll find out.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, let me give you another one of these questions because it's kind of going back to the House of Commons, but I think it still kind of gets at some of these institutional wranglings and how we navigate these particular spaces.
Okay.
So the student asked, when Jagmeet Singh called out a Bloc Québécois MP for being racist, he was asked to leave the House of Commons that day by the Speaker. Can you comment on how parliamentary rules have been unevenly applied and how this can be challenged? And what this really kind of highlighted for me is the ways that particular levers of action can be used within the context of institutions to make sure that certain things are not said, right? So what are the boundaries that are drawn to enforce the status quo, and how do you challenge those boundaries with whatever power that you wield?
Yeah, so it goes back to the transformative leader question, or like a statement where you're not afraid to get cut. Jug is not afraid to get cut.
Right.
Right. So they're going to pull that lever, even though we've seen in other situations in Parliament where people were just given a free pass. Right.
Right.
He's going to get the lever pulled and he's going to be asked to leave. We know that. When I called out Maxime Bernier and my party just left me to be gaslit. In fact, I don't even know if they were throwing logs on the fire, like just let her burn, like,
right.
throwing gas on it. I don't know what they were doing.
I remember it very well. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you just leave me there. Like, why would you do that? Why would you just leave me in the middle of that? And yeah, the thing is that you can't stop. So that happens because they want to be silent. They want to silence you. They want to silence Jug. You cannot say that. Celina, you cannot call that a privilege in 2018. You call it out in 2020. Right. You were 2 years too early.
Oh, you could do that in 2021, but 2018 was different. Different time, apparently. Right.
Right. So if Jug had done it now, maybe it's a different story. But back then, it's like, no, you can't do that. So how do you have to have more people in there. You have to have more people who are transformative leaders in this space that are not going to sit and go, oh, I don't see what's happening there. Like, no, look over, see it happening and say, Mr. Speaker, point of order. And just start saying, he cannot be called out for that. He should not have to leave. Mr. Speaker, and then somebody else, Mr. Speaker's point of order, somebody else, Mr. Speaker, point of order, not just from the NDP side, but from all sides, need to have enough guts to stand up and say, Mr. Speaker, point of order, and disrupt the whole thing. Make sure that there is a clear message sent that man over there should not be removed from this chamber for calling something that is so obvious. So obvious. And that's why we don't just need add women change politics, add diversity, add whatever. We need actually people who are going to push against the status quo, who are not afraid to get hurt.
And that's so interesting because you also you just mentioned that, okay, we need people from all sides, from all parties to kind of stand in that space.
Yes.
I'm reflecting on, for example, the I think it's the Parliamentary Black Caucus, right? And they put out the report last year, and this is supposed to be folk from all different political parties. Is there promise for those kinds of initiatives? Like, are those the kinds of spaces that people will start to stand up, or are those spaces useless? Because I have my suspicions, but I'd like to hear from you.
I would really like you to bring Matthew Green in on these conversations. Because, it's interesting because Matthew was on Black in the Maritimes, that podcast those young cats do out there. And he said, first of all, if it wasn't for Celina sort of planting the seed on some of this, no, her colleagues would have not got this far. Right. And, if I would say if it wasn't for Matthew Green being there, that statement would not have come out.
Right.
Because we like to fiddle, because we're there, and we like to fiddle, even sometimes with our own, we like to fiddle and say, oh, it's okay, we got something. No. You know, when people say to me, Celina, you've left the table, I said, well, first of all, I had the courage to see the table, to be at the table. And now I know what the bounty looks like on the table, right? You can't give me crumbs anymore. I see what you got. I'm not down for it anymore. So, you know, the Parliamentary Black Caucus also said that they wanted to repeal mandatory minimums. What did we get in C-22? We got something that, you know, honestly, the Minister of Justice and Attorney General and the Prime Minister, after taking a knee, should be embarrassed about. It has no teeth. It's still unconstitutional. It's an embarrassment. It's an affront to any form of justice. That is not justice in that piece of legislation. It is a slap in the face after 2020. It is an actual slap in the face. And I have to stop being actually mad before I respond to C-22.
Right. We pretty much took the words out of my mouth, right? Like, and I suppose that, you know, part of the reason why I went into political science in the first place was because I'd worked in politics before as a staffer, and I saw what you saw, and I didn't experience the same things in the same ways, but I experienced enough of the same things to come to similar conclusions. So I wanted to understand how these mechanisms worked, and I wanted to understand how different mechanisms could be constructed.
I was often called the Malcolm to their Martin. Like,
right.
Have you read about Martin? Do you actually know the man?
Do you know who he is?
You wouldn't say that.
that you, if you knew who he was.
You're mixing things up, brother. You're like, that is just the wrong thing to say. Like on so many different levels, right?
Right.
But you know, it's like, well, we just want to we want to pacify things and go along to get along. But Celina, if you keep acting disruptive, so we're going to put you out on the stick. If your neck on the chopping block, you keep being disruptive, so I could just, you know, sort of lay low and chill and not look like a disruptive one. You keep being disruptive, and you're going to help us get things done. Not everything, because, you know, everything you say, we're going to dampen it right down.
We're dampening it down, right? Like, if you create this radical system, we'll get like 50% of it, and that'll be fine.
At least I can say we're not Celina, you know?
Right.
Because we're not Celina. Like, we're not so, you know, bold. But give us something, but not Celina something, because we're not like the mad Black woman.
Right.
That's disappointing. So, yeah.
It is extremely disappointing, you know? And I guess, you know, we're almost coming up on time. I know we've got a few more minutes.
That was so
I know it's kind of gone quickly. I was like, oh my gosh. Okay. We've got about 5 minutes. Fantastic. Yeah. So I have a final question from the undergrads. I have a very quick kind of like blurb, not advertisement that I want to give you, and then I just want to leave you space to give some final comments. But I'll ask you the question first. How can we have meaningful and constructive conversations to challenge white feminism? That was one of the questions that the undergrad sent me.
Yes, let's go. Let's talk about it. Okay.
I wanted to give you some space for that.
Hood feminism yet. So first of all, let's read some Mickey Kendall, because that is like life for me, right?
Right.
So I what needs to happen is, like, people like me, we need to stop thinking about mainstream feminism as, you know, well, how many women could get into boardrooms and how many women could get into C-suite positions, when, especially right now, women can't put food on the table.
Right.
They don't.
Right.
Our PSWs they don't have benefits. They're not making a living wage. They're not getting sick leave.
They're not being given effective PPE, any of that stuff. Yeah. Right.
Like, this is what feminism needs to be focusing on. This is what intersectional feminism looks like. So this is a conversation. This should have been the whole hour, because, like, I'm amped.
Right.
So we can't do this in the last 5 minutes. Come on, man. You, Tari.
I should have foregrounded this one. I wanted to make sure there was space.
But I think what the point of it is that right now, if people actually want to understand, like when the government said after the speech from the throne that they were going to take an intersectional feminist approach to recovery after COVID, that is what an intersectional feminist approach means. You give people childcare, you make sure they have benefits, you make sure they have sick leave, you make sure that they have the PPE, so they're not dying while they're trying to save our lives. That is what it looks like. I am so angry. My next meeting is going to be a fiasco. You know that, right? But that's what it looks like. It's making sure that people could live.
Right.
People just want to live. We don't need every woman in the boardroom, because you know what? That has never benefited Black and Indigenous women. Never. We need to make sure that they could live. We need to actually draw attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. That is intersectional feminism. That is what feminism should be doing. But we've sort of like filtered it into this thing where we need to be in the ivory tower. We don't need any more ivory tower. We just need basics.
Thank you so much for that, because I think, you know, I almost, when it came down to hosting, I felt as if I didn't want to take up so much space to talk about some of these issues, even though I care so deeply about these issues. And I think you've said so many things here, so many enriching things that many of us wish that we could say within the context that we work within, that we move within, that we live within. And so the last thing that I wanted to ask you, or kind of allow you to expand upon, is this quote that keeps kind of sticky in my mind. It's from chapter 12. And you say, if you do not understand how valuable you are, you always accept what is given to you. Could you, with your final comments, could you just expand on that a little bit? Because I thought that was really enriching.
Yeah, you know, especially when I talk about, you know, our communities, and I'm not just talking here about Black communities, I'm talking about people with multiple intersecting identities. Just to be clear, when McKinsey, just because I want to actually bring the receipts on this, when McKinsey did the report on how to, on the cost of racial inequality in the United States, they said that it'll cost $1 to $1.5 trillion by 2028. When they did the report on giving women their tools to reach their full potential, they said that it'll add $28 trillion, 28 trillion to the global GDP. That is the value that we bring with multiple intersecting identities. I just named $30 trillion, right? That's you, Tari.
Right.
I just made it rain all over you this morning. That is us, right? This is who they're speaking about. And so your value, everything that we've done, never mind your school, never mind your work experience, everything that you've done to navigate the world, to jump over barriers, to get over hurdles, to get where you are, every mistake, everything that you've done that has taught you a lesson, creates value in you, and therefore you are an asset to any institution that you're in, to any organization, to any conversation you have. You are an asset. You are $30 trillion worth of asset to any organization. So if you don't know that, you keep trying to conform to fit into spaces. And when you conform, you leave part of that $30 trillion behind. Why would you want to do that? Bring your 100% selves, as long as it's safe. And because for trans people, that it's not safe to be in spaces. So when it's safe and it's to show up authentically, be 100% authentic, but it is also authentic when you say, I'm going to hide part of me because it's not safe to do so, and show up with the rest of me. That is also authenticity. So don't sell yourself short. But if you don't know that value, you'll always accept what you're given, unless you're giving me a positive return on that investment, meaning you're giving me something more than 30 trillion.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that's not just with jobs. That's not just with, that's anything you put your resource, time, energy, love into. If I'm talking to young people, because you have partners that are not giving you that positive return, you have to take that.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm going to just take this last minute before we go, just to thank a whole host of people. Firstly, you, Celina, for this incredible, just deeply enriching conversation. It's been really powerful and profound. I want to thank Dr. Laurie Turnbull for being a steadfast supporter, Dr. David Black for being a steadfast supporter. Also, so many of the other folks who've been involved in kind of organizing this event, Tracy Powell, Krista Cullymore, just so many folks. I really appreciate all of your help and support in doing this and for bringing this together today. And so, yeah, with that, I will leave it to Laurie to finish up.
Tari and Celina, thank you so much. I mean, this was such a powerful, informative, enriching, energizing conversation that I think we're going to have to take with us, because otherwise the rest of the day is going to be a real letdown. And so we're going to have to just sort of try to keep this conversation with us for the rest of the day and for a long time. We've learned a lot from you, and honestly, what a beautiful exchange between the two of you. I thank you so much. I can't even find the words. Thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for joining us this morning as well. We know, especially if you're joining from other parts of the country, it's quite early. And so we really appreciate everybody gathering with us today. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tari.
Thank you.
Were absolutely phenomenal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.